The hand is quicker than the eye. That's what magicians say. Skillful use for a prestidigitator or a pickpocket and common thief. And in 2008, one scientific study had attempted to track the eye movements of those watching a magic trick involving a vanishing cigarette being performed on a pre-recorded video, much like this one, by a stage illusionist of average ability. And even if participants looked directly at the secret move as it was occurring, they did not notice it if their attention was directed elsewhere skillfully by the performing magician. They looked but did not see, thanks to the magician's misdirection. Researchers found that the most significant factor for those detecting the secret move before it happened was not from any surprising cause. Prior information about the nature of the trick significantly improved participants' detection skills of the method. The informed participants fixated closer to the event in question, suggesting that they were monitoring it more closely once they knew about the trick. They had inside information. The probability of detection, however, was independent of how far the participant was looking from the secret when it happened. But participants who detected the event moved their eyes towards where it took place much earlier than the participants who missed it entirely. And one would reasonably predict that a trained magician would probably possess a far greater ability to detect the magic before any of the others, who are simply persons who may have had the opportunity once or twice to watch a few magic shows. Hello. Like some people are storm chasers, searching for tornadoes and hurricanes. Let us just say that other people may have performed similar work, maybe in the army, chasing everything from drug dealers and terrorists to spies and other bad actors. Or even dare say having had a chance to develop some uniquely special skills in chasing biological agents of terror. And one of the first things that may have caught their attention regarding COVID-19 was its pattern of migration, or the way that it appeared to move, escaping lockdowns in China within what had first appeared to be a matter of only about 2 weeks, before presenting the first imported cases to the United States. And somehow, it was a disease that had managed to avoid a mass migration to the top 3 cities for persons of Chinese ancestry, landing first in Seattle on the West Coast and in Boston on the East Coast, almost entirely missing Hawaii, and in rather short order, which a scientist would describe as an anomaly. A magician is quite a trick. The Delta variant emerged in India in October 2020 and did not arrive in the United States until May of 2021. But the Omicron variant emerged in South Africa in November 2021 and was in the United States by that December, becoming the predominant strain. Why did the highly contagious Delta variant take so long to arrive in America? It is a worthwhile question. It presents like a bit of sleight of hand, and one should be rather astounded and amazed. What was more intriguing about the initial cases was the fact that these first infected persons had managed to travel all the way from China and had failed to infect anybody else with what was described in the press and by the government as a highly contagious disease, which is not what the scientists had described it to be in the science reports, not reported in the press. On January 10th, 2020, when the first fatality was reported in China, even the New York Times, however, had reported that public health officials had found no evidence to support a conclusion that COVID-19 possessed an ability to be transmitted from person to person, which would be the same claim that Senator Rand Paul had in 2021 regarding the COVID-19 and intermediary animal sources. And by March 15, 2020, there were over 3,000 cases of COVID-19 in the United States, while an examination of almost 56,000 laboratory-confirmed cases in China around that time and their tracer contacts had concluded that it is not clear whether this correlates with the presence of an infectious virus. And this is where understanding the science, the magic, becomes important. This conclusion was based on a clinical finding that the secondary attack rate, where to look, had been determined was less than 5%, or clinically 4 times too low to confirm the presence of a disease being transmitted from person to person, and 12 times too low to set off a super spreader event, regardless of what you saw with your eyes. According to former Harvard professor of science philosophy Thomas Kuhn, the business of science is resolving anomalies to develop one unified theory. And the guiding rule is that if one explanation resolves all anomalies, then it is probably the correct one. Sounds like something from Sherlock Holmes. And by early April 2020, most Americans had heard some conspiracy theories about a novel coronavirus, and some 23% were absolutely convinced that it had originated in a laboratory and leaked. Republican Senator Rand Paul has indicated that when you look at COVID-19, it doesn't even seem to infect bats very well, that it doesn't infect an intermediate animal, and that they checked 80,000 animals at the wet markets in Wuhan, and none of the animals at the wet market would accept COVID-19 or were positive for it. But it looks like it's most well adapted for humans, concluding that this is worrisome, and yet more evidence that this, in all likelihood, came from the lab, as was reported on Fox News on June 19, 2021, at a time when the reportedly highly contagious Delta variant with an R0 as high as 8 or 9, according to CDC Director Rochelle Walensky, was beginning to take hold in America. And these are 2 medical doctors, one an eye surgeon, and the other primarily an instructor and professor at medical schools with not really a lot of practice. And practice makes perfect. But neither one, despite being a position as an expert on infectious disease or epidemiology, nor are most Americans, for that matter. And with a disease that has been attributed to the deaths of over 993,000 Americans, over 6.2 million persons worldwide, in any court of competent jurisdiction, you cannot expect to prevail on an argument that in all likelihood COVID-19 escaped from a Wuhan laboratory. In fact, discussing the fairly debatable standard in the Commonwealth, in the matter Wilkins, as in former Speaker Vance Wilkins v. West, decided in 2002, an election case, the court stated that if the validity of the legislature's reconciliation of various criteria is fairly debatable and not clearly erroneous, arbitrary, or wholly unwarranted, it will not be disturbed. Those are the magical rules of a courtroom. Moreover, discussing the rule guiding regulatory deference, the Supreme Court stated in Chevron USA v. NRDC, decided in 1984 and familiar to most law students, quoting U.S. v. Scheimer, decided in 1961. The rule is that considerable weight should be accorded to an executive department's construction of a statutory scheme it is entrusted to administer. And the principle of deference to administrative interpretations has been consistently followed by this court whenever decision as to the meaning or reach of a statute has involved reconciling conflicting policies and a full understanding of the force of the statutory policy of the given situation has depended upon more than ordinary knowledge respecting the matters subjected to agency regulations. Under that rule, a regulatory deference, Fauci says, is actually the rule. For to rebut the presumption that a regulation represents a reasonable accommodation of manifestly competing interests, defeating its entitlement to deference, a plaintiff must establish that the agency interpretation or regulation was clearly erroneous. And a finding is clearly erroneous when, although there is evidence to support it, the reviewing court on the entire evidence is left with a definite and firm conviction that a mistake has been committed. This is a well-known standard that had been articulated by the U.S. Supreme Court in U.S. v. United States Gypsum Company in 1948, which was reiterated in Anderson v. City of Bessemer City, North Carolina, decided in 1985. A finding is clearly erroneous when the court is left with a definite and firm conviction that a mistake has been committed, which is very similar to the burden of proof in a criminal trial beyond a reasonable doubt. Chicago. So let's try to think like a lawyer to test the theory of Senator Rand Paul that COVID-19 had likely escaped from a lab. And this is where the numbers again become important to a magician performing the magic trick. The New York Times reported on January 8th and January 10th, 2020, that scientists found no evidence that COVID-19 could be transmitted between persons. The World Health Organization repeated this claim on February 24th, 2020, stating that it is not clear whether this correlates with the presence of an infectious virus. And in October 2020, the largest sample size tracer contact study to date had confirmed that COVID-19 had only a 4.6% secondary attack rate, 4 times too low to be transmitted from person to person, and 12 times too low to set off a super spreader event. And so if a biological agent cannot be transmitted from person to person, it cannot be transmitted, it cannot escape from a laboratory to set off a pandemic, or infect one person who in turn sets off a pandemic. To say otherwise would be clearly erroneous under the science and simply would not be logical or make any sense. In 2006, some research scientists looked again at the phenomenon of stage illusion and its effects on the audience, prepared to be astounded and amazed. A magician threw a ball into the air a few times. On the third row, however, he only pretended to throw it. 2/3 of the participants reported seeing the ball vanish in mid-air before their very eyes, even though it had never left his hand. And at least for a scientist, you cannot prevent or mitigate a problem that you do not understand. On February 24th, after a 2-week extensive study of over 55,000 cases, the World Health Organization still could not definitively conclude that a novel coronavirus was being transmitted by droplets from person to person, because tracer contacts found less than 5% of secondary infections. And because once again infection spread appeared to be driven by families living in close connection for extended periods, exacerbated by the draconian lockdown orders. Around the same time, the Centers for Disease Control examined cluster outbreaks that occurred aboard luxury cruise ships like the Princess Diamond, which set sail from the port in Yokohama, Japan, and where, despite a quarantine immediately implemented, infections continued to rise, finding the highest incidence of infection, ironically, amongst American passengers and crew, somehow selecting them from all the rest. And while observing simply these facts in isolation, it may be rather simple to conclude that the infected persons naturally infected one another. There still arises just one simple problem. How on earth did the pathogen arrive in the first place? Someone had to bring it to the farmhouses in China, and someone had to bring it to the cabins of the passengers aboard the cruise ships. The American passengers and the American crew. And why, only after extended interactions that this extraordinary pathogen only produce effects upon them. If a fire were to break out in a farmhouse or in a cruise ship cabin, the natural inclination is not to conclude that the occupants burned one another, because the fire, like in a stage illusion, captures our eyes and imagination, leading us to what appears to be a plausible conclusion. But if a disease were to break out, our natural inclination is to conclude that an infected person would have caused the other persons to be infected. And scientists call that person the index case, as is found in the Skagit County Choir rehearsal that many state governors have used in courts to close churches before Easter. But for a moment, imagine yourself as a magician, producing the grandest delusion in the world. Isn't that exactly what you would want your audience to think? And you look like an intelligent person.
This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.